Alice, you have no idea what it looks like from the other side, Jacob said, his voice quiet but strangely confident. I froze. My stepfather, Jacob, had always been incredibly reserved. At 54, he was fit and carried an undeniable charisma. My mother always said how lucky she was to have found such a man, especially after my father left our lives. But tonight, as we were alone in the house, his words sounded completely different than ever before. I stood in front of him in my new black dress, the one I had chosen for a party. It was tight, short, with an open back, the kind I would never have worn if I had known he would be home. But with the party cancelled, I ended up here, in the kitchen, under his watchful gaze. I just wanted some water, I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. This dress. He paused and licked his lips. It draws attention. I only wore it for myself, I answered quickly, but his look made me feel as if he was seeing me in an entirely different light. His hand slid carefully toward the back of a chair as he stepped a bit closer. Only a few inches separated us. Mom will be late, you know that, right? He said quietly. In that moment, my heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The small kitchen, with its humming refrigerator and ticking clock, suddenly felt like a confined stage set for something dangerous. I tried to steady my breathing, but each second stretched longer than the last. My mind raced with questions. What did he mean by the other side? Was it just a comment on my appearance, or was there something more? I forced myself to speak. Jacob, what are you trying to say? My voice trembled, but I had to know his intentions. He stepped even closer, and the space between us shrank further until I could feel the heat of his presence. Every instinct screamed for me to back away, yet my feet felt rooted to the floor. Don't you see, he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. This isn't just about a dress. His tone was calm and deliberate. I sensed that he had planned every word, every pause. It was as if he was challenging me to see something about myself that I had never considered. I felt exposed, not just physically in my daring outfit, but emotionally, as if every secret part of me was laid bare. I glanced around the room, desperate for a distraction. The familiar clink of dishes and the low hum of the kitchen appliances did nothing to ease the rising tension. My mind flipped through every rule I'd ever known in this house, every boundary that had been set without question. Now, standing face to face with Jacob, those lines seemed to vanish before my eyes. I wore it because I wanted to feel confident. I managed, my words sounding weak even to my own ears. But deep down, I knew that tonight had stirred something forbidden within me, a spark that I was both terrified of and oddly drawn to. Jacob's gaze hardened slightly as he took another measured step forward. His hand, still lingering near the back of that chair, seemed to signal that he was prepared to cross a line that I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. Alice, he said, his voice low and steady, there's a side of you that you haven't allowed to show. I see it tonight. His words hit me like a jolt. For a long moment, the only sound was the persistent ticking of the clock. I felt as if I were caught in a silent battle, one between the urge to retreat into the safety of the known and a dangerous curiosity about what he might be offering. The air between us was charged, and every heartbeat echoed like a drum signaling the approach of something irreversible. My mind screamed to escape, to run to a place where nothing like this could happen. Yet, even as fear tightened its grip on me, I found myself rooted to the spot. I remembered my mother's warnings about overstepping unspoken boundaries and the careful balance that had always defined our home. Now, that balance was tipping, and I was powerless to stop it. Jacob's eyes flickered with an intensity that made it hard to look away. Don't you want to know who you really are? He asked, not as a question but as a command. I felt the weight of his words press down on me, and I struggled to find a response. Every part of me wanted to say no, to push him away and restore the normal order of things. But a small, unsettling part of me wondered if perhaps this was the moment that would change everything. I glanced at the door, aware that if my mother returned at any moment, the fragile tension would shatter into chaos. The thought filled me with dread, yet it also underscored the dangerous allure of the situation. The forbidden spark had been ignited, and there was no turning back. My heart raced as I stood there, caught between terror and an inexplicable pull. I knew that the night was far from over, and that the coming moments would force me to confront choices I had never imagined. As I looked into Jacob's unwavering eyes, I realized that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. And just as I braced myself for the next move, I couldn't help but think, what happens next will be even more shocking. The next day, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I went about my morning routine and attempted to settle back into normality. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob's behavior had changed. His glances grew more frequent throughout the day, and it seemed as if he was deliberately reducing the distance between us. No matter where I went in the house, I felt his eyes following me, making each routine moment feel charged with unspoken tension. While I was sitting in my room and scrolling through my phone, I heard the soft sound of the door opening behind me. I looked up and saw Jacob standing in the doorway. "Alice," he said quietly, "may I come in?" His tone was calm, but carried a note of insistence that made my pulse quicken. I managed a simple, "Yes, of course," and watched as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him without a word. Jacob moved directly to the edge of my bed and sat down. "I just wanted to talk," he began, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that left little room for misunderstanding. His gaze was so direct that I felt my hands start to tremble. I focused on the small details, the slight scratches on my nails, to distract myself from the intensity of his stare. "You should not think that you are alone here," Jacob said in a low voice, almost matter-of-factly. As he spoke, his hand lowered to rest near me, coming close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. I replied quietly, "I know," but his words, ambiguous as they were, left me uncertain about what he meant. Was he simply stating a fact, or was he hinting at something more? There was little else said. The conversation was brief, punctuated by long pauses and heavy silence. I tried to ask him about his day, hoping for a normal discussion, but his responses were curt. Each answer seemed to deepen the tension rather than ease it. It was clear that he had a purpose behind this visit, a purpose that I was not prepared to understand. After a few minutes, Jacob suddenly stood up. "I have to go," he said, glancing toward the door as if that was the natural conclusion to our brief exchange. Before he left, however, he paused at the doorway and added, "Remember, you're not alone here." His parting words left a lingering sense of unease as he stepped out and closed the door behind him. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I moved through my usual activities, but every small noise or movement made me look over my shoulder, expecting to see him lurking in the background. His presence had become a silent, constant reminder that things were not as they once were. Despite my attempts to focus on work and other tasks, the uneasy feeling persisted. Later that evening, after my mother had left for her errands, I resolved to avoid any further encounters with Jacob. I decided to keep to my room and limit my movements around the house, hoping that maintaining physical distance might restore some sense of normalcy. However, the familiar layout of the house now felt different, as though every corner held the possibility of an unexpected encounter. I walked down the hall toward the bathroom to get a glass of water. As I passed the bathroom door, I noticed something unusual. The door was left slightly ajar, and the light inside was still on. This was not how things usually were. Normally, the bathroom was kept closed, and the light was turned off when not in use. I paused in the hall, my curiosity piqued and my heart beginning to beat faster. I approached the bathroom slowly and peeked inside. There, standing near the mirror, was Jacob. His posture was relaxed but alert, and he was alone. Notably, his t-shirt was removed, revealing a bare chest. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of why I continued to watch him. My mind raced with questions about his behavior and intentions, but I couldn't bring myself to move. For a long moment, I just observed in silence. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the ventilation and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the background. Then, as if sensing my presence, Jacob turned around. His eyes met mine across the small space between us. In that brief, silent exchange, everything seemed to pause. I stopped, not knowing why I continued to watch, and at that moment he turned around. His eyes met mine, and he smiled. The next few days were pure chaos. I went about my usual routines, but every step felt shadowed by Jacob's constant presence. He was no longer content with brief glances from across the room. Instead, he made a habit of standing behind me while I prepared meals, his hand occasionally brushing against my shoulder as if by accident. When I sat in the living room to watch a TV show, I often found him seated uncomfortably close, his eyes fixed on me in a way that made it impossible to ignore his intent. Each encounter added to the growing tension, and I felt increasingly trapped in my own home. I tried to maintain a normal schedule, but every time I moved from one room to another, it seemed as though Jacob was there, almost as if he were following me deliberately. His behavior, once subtle, had grown more direct. I began to feel that the boundaries I had long relied on were quickly eroding. That evening, after a long day of trying to avoid him, I decided to retreat to the safety of my room. I closed my door firmly, thinking that solitude might help me regain control over my racing thoughts. I sat on my bed, trying to focus on a book, when a knock sounded at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so the unexpected noise made my heart skip a beat. I heard a familiar voice call, "Alice," in a calm yet insistent tone. Reluctantly, I responded, "Yes?" Before I could gather my thoughts, the door opened without waiting for my permission. Jacob stepped inside holding a bottle of wine. His presence filled the small room instantly, and I felt a surge of anxiety mixed with confusion. "Let's have a drink while Mom is out." "It's just one glass," he said. His tone was firm, leaving little room for me to refuse. I hesitated, not knowing what to say. The silence stretched for a moment as he moved to sit on the edge of my bed. I did not protest. Instead, I silently allowed him to take a seat beside me. We poured a glass of wine each, and the simple act of drinking together made the situation feel even more charged. The room was quiet except for the sound of wine being poured and our shallow breathing. I tried to focus on the bottle, hoping to steady my thoughts, but the tension between us was unmistakable. As we continued drinking, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the closeness of his presence. With each glass, my internal conflict grew. I wanted to maintain the boundaries that had always kept me safe, but Jacob's insistence blurred those lines. Our conversation was sparse. Every word exchanged seemed loaded with meaning. I attempted to steer the dialogue toward mundane topics, comments about the day or neutral observations, but his responses were curt and pointed. After our second glass, Jacob shifted his position so that he was even closer. I could feel the heat of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing as he leaned toward me. In that moment, the situation felt both dangerous and inevitable. I struggled internally, aware that any decision now could lead to consequences I wasn't sure I could handle. I had spent the past few days actively avoiding him, and now it was clear that avoidance was no longer an option. Lowering his voice, Jacob said, "Alice, I've never felt this way before." His words were quiet, but carried a force that made my pulse race. I felt a shiver run down my arm as I processed his statement. I knew that his admission meant crossing a line I had carefully maintained for as long as I could remember. "We shouldn't do this," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Even as I spoke, I could feel my resolve weakening. Jacob reached out, and his hand brushed against mine. For a moment, I froze, torn between my instinct to pull away and a confusing curiosity about what was unfolding. His touch was gentle but persistent, and I found myself unable to fully retract my hand from his. The silence in the room deepened, filled only by the soft clink of the wine glasses and the steady hum of the air conditioner. Every sip of wine made it harder for me to think clearly, and the air between us grew heavier with unspoken implications. I tried to regain control of the conversation by shifting my focus. "We really shouldn't," I repeated, hoping that the simple statement would re-establish the boundary I desperately needed. But Jacob's eyes held mine with an intensity that made my words feel insufficient. He leaned even closer, his gaze searching mine for understanding, or perhaps for permission. The closeness was overwhelming. I became acutely aware of every detail, the warmth of his hand, the firmness of his grip, and the subtle determination in his expression. I felt trapped in a moment that was spiraling out of my control. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts, the need to preserve my safety and the unsettling pull toward something unfamiliar. The rational part of me screamed to end the encounter immediately, yet another part, fraught with confusion, hesitated. As if to tip the balance further, Jacob's hand inched closer along my arm. His fingers brushed lightly at first, and then they began to slide upward, each movement deliberate and unyielding. I could feel his intent with every gentle press, and it became clear that he was testing the boundaries I had so carefully set. I tried to push back mentally, repeating my earlier plea, "We shouldn't do this," but even as I said it, I realized my determination was faltering. At that moment, I was caught between the need to stop him and a disturbing curiosity about where this would lead. The room felt smaller, and every sound was amplified, the quiet murmur of our conversation, the faint sound of the clock ticking, and the soft rustle of fabric as Jacob's hand continued its steady progress. The line between what was acceptable and what was forbidden was rapidly disappearing before my eyes. I closed my eyes briefly, summoning every bit of strength to reassert my boundaries, to make it clear that this was not acceptable. But before I could find the right words or muster the courage to push him away, his fingers slid along my arm, moving higher. Evening had settled over the house, and the soft glow of the table lamps filled the rooms with a muted light. My mother had informed me earlier that she would be out until late, which meant I had the house entirely to myself. My plan for the night was simple: stay away from Jacob, whose closeness had become increasingly difficult to ignore over the past few days. I walked into the kitchen to make myself some tea. As I reached for the kettle, I noticed that Jacob was already there, standing by the refrigerator. The kitchen, usually a place of calm routine, felt different now. There was a palpable tension in the air that I couldn't shake off. "Tea again? Perhaps something stronger?" Jacob asked, his tone low and direct. I glanced down and saw that he was holding a sealed bottle of wine, the same bottle my mother had bought earlier that day. His question was unexpected, and I hesitated for a moment before replying. "No, thank you," I said, keeping my tone even. Internally, I felt a growing unease. I had hoped that tonight would be a quiet evening without complications, but his presence was already disrupting that plan. "Why not?" he pressed, stepping closer until he stood right beside me. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, and the sudden proximity made my skin feel overly sensitive. I tried to step back, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. "I'm just tired," I offered, avoiding his eyes as I spoke. I hoped that by stating a simple reason, I might diffuse the situation. I had been careful to plan my evening around maintaining my space, but Jacob's unexpected intrusion was challenging that resolve. He did not move away. Instead, he shifted his gaze to mine and said, "You seem so tense, Alice. Is it because of me?" His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable insistence. At that moment, he reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. I felt his fingers slide slowly toward my neck. The contact was light yet deliberate, and it made me hold my breath involuntarily. "You know I won't do anything you don't want," he whispered as he leaned in a little closer. His eyes searched mine, and I could see that he was testing my reaction. His fingers moved from my shoulder to rest on my hand, brushing against my bare skin. I felt a mix of apprehension and a strange pull that left me momentarily paralyzed. I tried to speak, to reclaim some control over the situation. "We really shouldn't do this," I repeated, though my voice wavered. The words sounded weak even to my own ears. His hand remained on mine, and his gaze did not waver as he continued to hold my attention with an intensity that left me feeling exposed. For several long moments, the only sounds in the room were the quiet hum of the refrigerator and our shallow breaths. I stood there, caught between the urge to pull away and a disturbing curiosity about what might happen next. Every second seemed to weigh heavily on me, as if I were on the verge of making a decision that would change everything. Jacob's hand then shifted slightly, moving from my hand toward my waist. The simple act of his fingers brushing against my skin made my heart race. I could feel the steady pressure of his touch as it moved deliberately, testing the limits of the boundary I had so carefully maintained. Despite my internal struggle, I found it difficult to break away. My body felt locked in place. "Alice, this is just a conversation," he said in a steady tone. "If you want, I can leave." His words were meant to offer me an escape, yet the firmness in his voice suggested that he was not truly prepared to let go of the moment. The sincerity in his gaze, combined with the continuity of his touch, left me with a profound sense of conflict. I looked down at his hand, then back up at his face, trying to gauge his intentions. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, I was terrified of what might happen if I allowed the situation to escalate. On the other, I felt a strange curiosity that kept me rooted in place. Every rational part of me screamed to end this encounter immediately, yet another part hesitated, caught up in the intensity of the moment. The steady light from the lamps cast clear shadows across the room, emphasizing the closeness between us. I took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to clear my thoughts. I needed to reassert my boundaries, to remind both of us that this was not acceptable. "We shouldn't," I repeated, louder this time, as if convincing myself as much as him. Yet his hand did not withdraw. It continued its gentle, insistent motion along my waist. Jacob's eyes held mine steadily, and his next words carried a weight that made it hard to think. "Alice, I've never felt like this before." The admission was simple, without embellishment, yet it carried an implication that unsettled me. His gaze was heavy and searching, as if he was waiting for a sign from me, a sign that would either confirm his actions or force him to retreat. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat echoing in the silence that had enveloped us. My thoughts were a jumble of caution and confusion. I had spent the past few days trying to avoid such encounters, to keep a safe distance from Jacob. Yet here I was, standing in the kitchen with him so close, his hand on my waist, and his voice urging me to consider something I wasn't sure I wanted. The conversation had reached a point where the decision was imminent. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, and I realized that every action from this point forward would have lasting consequences. The room felt smaller, the distance between us nearly non-existent. I was standing on the edge of a line that I knew, deep down, could not be crossed without changing everything. In that charged silence, as Jacob's hand remained on my skin and his eyes searched mine, I understood the gravity of the situation. My internal conflict, the battle between self-preservation and a dangerous curiosity, reached its peak. Every rational thought told me to step back, to end this interaction now before it spiraled out of control. Yet the intensity of the moment made it nearly impossible to move. And it was at that exact moment, with his gentle touch lingering on my waist and his voice echoing in the quiet room, that I realized we were approaching a line that could not be crossed without consequences. After that moment, I felt overwhelmed by the weight of what had just occurred. I needed space to think, so I excused myself and retreated to my room. I locked the door behind me, hoping that some solitude might ease the turmoil raging inside. My hands still trembled, and every sound, the ticking clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, even the wind outside, seemed unbearably loud. I sat on my bed, trying to steady my breathing and clear my thoughts. I had convinced myself that Jacob would back off after our last encounter, that he would give me the distance I so desperately needed. But deep down, I feared that nothing would go back to the way it once was. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, expecting the unsettling tension to dissipate. Instead, every minute stretched into an eternity. I kept replaying the moments from earlier in my mind, the way his hand had lingered on my waist, the intensity of his gaze, and the realization that we were dangerously close to crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. Just when I began to convince myself that I could endure a few more minutes of solitude, a soft, almost hesitant knock sounded at my door. My heart pounded as I heard a quiet voice, "Alice, may I come in?" It was Jacob. I mustered a weak reply, "I need to be alone," even though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. Before I could decide on a course of action, the door opened without further hesitation. Jacob stepped into my room without waiting for an invitation. There was something different in his demeanor, a mixture of confidence and an unexpected gentleness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let his gaze linger on me as if trying to read my state of mind. After a few seconds of silence, he said, "I just wanted to check on you." He closed the door behind him, and his eyes did not leave mine. In that moment, I realized he had come here for more than just a casual conversation. Despite my attempts to hide it, the events of the past few days had clearly taken their toll on both of us. "Everything's fine," I replied quickly, turning my eyes away from his. I hoped that dismissing his concern would end the interaction, but Jacob was not ready to leave. He slowly moved toward the edge of my bed and sat down, positioning himself so close that I could faintly smell his cologne. The close proximity intensified the confusion and conflict I felt inside. His voice dropped to a husky whisper as he said, "Alice, I can't ignore this any longer. You feel it too, don't you?" His words forced me to confront the reality I had been trying to avoid. I felt my body freeze. My heart beat rapidly, and I could hardly form a response. Before I could speak, Jacob reached out and gently touched my face. I wanted to pull away, to re-establish the distance I needed, but something in his warm, steady touch left me momentarily paralyzed. "This is wrong," I managed to whisper, though my voice wavered with uncertainty. His fingers slid lightly from my face down to my neck and then to my shoulder, as if testing the boundaries of what was acceptable. "But it doesn't seem wrong," he murmured as he leaned closer, his tone soft yet insistent. I struggled internally, caught between the instinct to retreat and a dangerous curiosity about where this was leading. My mind raced with thoughts of the irreversible consequences that lay ahead if we continued down this path. Before I could gather my resolve to push him away, the silence was shattered by the sudden sound of the door swinging open. I jerked my head toward the sound to see my mother standing in the doorway. Her eyes widened in shock as she took in the scene, Jacob and I, uncomfortably close, with his hand still resting on my shoulder. Her voice was cold and firm as she demanded, "What is happening here?" I recoiled as if struck, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. Jacob's expression shifted instantly, caught off guard, and his confident demeanor crumbled into a look of regret and alarm. The silence that had hung between us now became suffocating, filled with the weight of our actions and my mother's disapproval. Jacob tried to speak, beginning with, "This isn't what you think," but my mother's piercing gaze silenced him instantly. In that moment, everything had changed. The fragile line we had teetered on was irreparably crossed. My mind reeled as I realized that no matter what I wanted now, the consequences of this moment would reshape our lives permanently. I stood there, heart pounding and breath shallow, feeling utterly exposed. My mother's disapproving eyes bore into both of us, and the reality of the situation settled in. I wanted to take back every moment that had led us here, to undo the irreversible, but I knew it was too late. The bond of trust and the established order of our household had been shattered. As my mother's shock gave way to a stern demand for explanation, I found myself unable to articulate the complexity of what had just transpired. Jacob's earlier assurances, his gentle touch, and the unspoken promises now lay in ruins before us. The room was filled with an unbearable silence, marking the moment that would forever alter the course of our lives.